So Netanyahu is going to play Joe Biden like a fiddle. You can make the argument that he will play in due course Donald Trump like a fiddle. We'll see what happens. But if you look at precedents, there's every reason to think that Netanyahu, if he goes toe to toe with Donald Trump, will win. I mean, there's no question that any president of the United States is going to have incredibly small amounts of maneuver room when dealing with Israel because of the power of the lobby. Well, it's quite clear the Israelis are going to stay and probably try to annex a big slice of southern Syria. And by the way, they're staying in southern Lebanon as well. They've not left there, which they were supposed to do according to the terms of the ceasefire. And by the way, they've also said they're not going to abandon the Philadelphia corridor, which is the line between Egypt and Gaza, which they were obliged to do this Saturday when the second phase of the ceasefire is put in play. The Israelis are doing absolutely horrible things in the West Bank, as they continue to do in the Gaza Strip. And their ultimate goal, again, is to drive the Palestinians out. And a permanent ceasefire will get in the way of that. I think the last thing he wants is a permanent ceasefire, because I think the ultimate goal that Israel has is to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians from Greater Israel. And this includes the West Bank as well as Gaza. And although what's going on in the West Bank doesn't get as much attention as what's going on in Gaza, but my guess is that the Arab League will come up with a plan for Gaza and may even come up with a plan that includes the West Bank. But the question is, what will the Israelis do? And the Israelis will not pay any attention to that plan. They're not going to accept an Arab plan. And furthermore, the Americans and the Europeans will back the Israelis up no matter what. So we'll be back to square one. So Netanyahu may be gloating now, but he ought to think long and hard, as many Israelis and their supporters should think, about where this country is, where it's headed, and what that all adds up to, because this is not good. So the Israelis they just do what they want. And again, the United States and the Europeans will back them no matter what. So what you see here is creeping annexation. And this is hardly surprising at all. Netanyahu talked about admiration for Israel. When I was young, there was a great deal of admiration for Israel in the United States and really around the world. But what's happened over time, and it's accelerated in the last few years, is that Israel has become a pariah state in almost all quarters. It's really quite remarkable. I believe here, even in the United States, there is a significant slice of the population that fully understands what Israel has become and where Israel is headed. And of course, as I've said on a number of occasions on this show, this situation's only going to get worse with time. Because in those days, remember, I was there from 1966 to 1970, and the Israelis won the war in 1948. They won a war in 56, and then they won the 97 war, which was widely viewed as a classic military victory on a par with the German victory against France in 1940. So they were very highly regarded. And furthermore, in those days, the Israelis were considered David up against Goliath. Because many of the myths that underpin that David versus Goliath worldview had not been shattered. But since, the early 1970s, my thinking, and I think the thinking of large numbers of people, including many Israelis, about Israel itself has changed significantly. I mean, you want to remember that the United States has a deep-seated interest in having stability in the Middle East. You remember Jake Sullivan, about 2 weeks before October 7th, was really pleased to announce that the Middle East had never been so peaceful in a long time, and this was really good news for the United States. Well, what applied then applies now. Trump has a deep-seated interest in having a peaceful Middle East. He has a deep-seated interest in solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, just like he has a deep-seated interest in solving the Ukrainian conflict. The problem that Trump faces is he has so many different problems on his plate, so many situations where he's fundamentally trying to fundamentally alter policy, and he's running into resistance in every one of those cases. So he has to be careful that he's not overwhelmed. And he may just not want to spend the political capital to defeat the lobby or to confront the lobby on Gaza because he wants to save his political capital for dealing with Ukraine. The question is, what can he do to achieve that end? And I would say, in response to your question, that if Netanyahu starts the genocide again, or even just large-scale killing, that I think Trump has very powerful incentives to get Bibi to shut it down. And I would not be surprised if Trump has allies inside of Israel. Again, I think the IDF has had enough war for the time being and would be sympathetic to any moves that Trump made to prevent Bibi from starting the genocide again. So one could argue that at this point in time, from Trump's point of view, Ukraine is the number one issue. And how he thinks about the Middle East will be heavily influenced by what's going on vis-a-vis the Russians. Trump makes so many boasts that he doesn't carry through on, that the costs of making these sorts of boasts and then not delivering is not very great. It's like when he says Canada is going to become the 51st state. Who seriously believes that? Or who seriously believes that he's going to turn the Gaza Strip into the Riviera of the Middle East? Even Lindsey Graham has told them that this is a foolish idea. I'm not arguing that there are statements that he makes that are of no consequence at all. Some statements that he makes are of huge consequence. And what he's doing on Ukraine, and in particular what he's doing vis-a-vis Zelensky, is of great consequence. So he just makes these boasts and people don't pay much attention to them. Biden was president when the genocide started, and Biden had all sorts of opportunities to act to stop the genocide and to influence Israeli policy in Gaza in ways that would put an end to the killing. This is not an issue for Trump at this point. Trump is walking into a situation where there is a ceasefire and where the Israelis really don't have an incentive to start up again with the genocide. There's no question that Trump, like Biden, is going to give the Israelis all of the deadly weaponry that they want and that we have. With some small exceptions. So in that sense, there's a continuation. But I think the key point you want to keep in mind is that Trump is operating in a very different environment, strategic environment in the Middle East than Biden was operating in. So the question is, how does Trump operate in that situation, which again is very different than the one that Biden confronted when he was president? Now, Netanyahu may have inclinations in that direction, but I think even he realizes that's not in his interest. His interest is just to make sure you don't have a ceasefire so he can keep his coalition together. You want to remember the IDF is in many ways a spent force. You don't hear much about this here in the West, but I believe the principal reason that you got a ceasefire on January 19th, and one of the principal reasons you're likely to get a second phase, is because the IDF is not interested in starting the war up again. He wants to make sure doesn't happen, I believe, is that you get a second phase of the ceasefire. And if you do get a second phase of the ceasefire, you don't get a third phase. He doesn't want a ceasefire, but that's not the same as saying that he wants to go in to Gaza and start the genocide up again. I think that the Saudis are at a point now where it's almost impossible to imagine them backing off from their demand that there be a Palestinian state before you have an Abraham Accord. Nor do the Saudis want a Palestinian state in Jordan or in Egypt. Right. They want a Palestinian state in the West Bank and in Gaza, with the capital of that Palestinian state being East Jerusalem. And I think the chances of that happening are remote, to put it mildly. And therefore, it's hard for me to imagine that you're going to get an Abraham Accord anytime soon, despite the fact that Trump wants it. And of course, the Israelis want it as well. China has grown more powerful economically. It's turned a lot of that economic might into military might. And as you would expect, they're beginning to, throw their weight around. They're acting much the way the United States acts. As you well know, the United States has a Navy that has a significant forward presence, and we're constantly roaming around in the waters right off the coast of countries like China. This is just sort of the normal course of events for us. And what you should expect to happen is, as China gets more powerful, that it's going to build a blue water Navy with a lot of power projection capability, and it's going to try to throw its weight around. It's going to try to send signals to the Australians, send signals to the Filipinos that we're in charge here. I think that's a misreading of the Chinese. The Chinese are not a status quo power. They want to dominate the South China Sea, and this explains a lot of what's going on with the Philippines. And they want to reduce American influence as much as possible in East Asia. And if anything, push the Americans beyond the first island chain, then beyond the second island chain. Well, I think it's important to emphasize that the Chinese are hardball players. They are interested in dominating East Asia, just the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. It's commonplace in this country to make the argument that it's the United States the source of all trouble in East Asia, and that the Chinese are basically satisfied with the status quo. And if the Americans would just back off, we could live happily ever after. I think what they're doing is they're asserting their influence in East Asia. Well, you want to remember that once Germany is on its own and Germany has to provide for its own security, it will think about the world much more differently than it does now, because now it has the United States sitting on top of it. Germany doesn't have nuclear weapons. What's going to happen if the United States leaves to Germany in the pursuit of nuclear weapons? Are they going to get their own nuclear weapons? Are they not? And furthermore, in between Germany and Russia, there is a lot of territory, and there's a lot of potential for conflict in that piece of territory between Russia and Germany, and a security competition could take place. So there are just all sorts of scenarios that are hard to predict that lead to big trouble. And what you want to do if you're a European is you want to head this trouble off at the pass. And the best way to do that is to keep Uncle Sam firmly enmeshed in the European security equation. I think they think that threat inflation is essential to keep their publics on board, and also as a way to maybe convince the Americans that the boogeyman is coming and that Europe needs help from the United States, much the way it did in World War I. There's an important economic dimension, but it's very important to understand that a large-scale American military presence in Europe serves as a pacifier. The Europeans like being subservient to the United States because the United States keeps the peace. Their great fear is not so much that the Russians are going to attack into Western Europe. Their great fear is that the Americans are going to leave and they're going to be left on their own. And they know what's happened in the past when they were left on their own. And it usually is not a happy ending. Two simple reasons. One is the profound Russophobia in the West, and especially in the United States, because of the widespread belief that Putin is responsible for Trump winning in 2016. But that profound Russophobia gets in the way of seeing things clearly. I mean, that's the basic idea, to remake the world in our own image. We're the good guys. Anybody who doesn't have a liberal democratic system like us is a bad guy. And our basic goal is to transform those bad guys into good guys with the belief that we will all then live happily ever after. And then the other thing is that during the unipolar moment, when the Ukraine disaster was set in train, American foreign policy was not run according to realist dictates. It was run according to a liberal ideology. And that liberal ideology was very expansionist in nature. And it not only led to the forever wars, it also led to this crisis with Ukraine. You want to remember that We focus on NATO expansion when we talk about what caused this war, the Ukraine war, that is. But it's important to emphasize that it was just not NATO expansion, because NATO expansion was part of a package deal. And that deal included EU expansion as well as NATO expansion. And it included a color revolution. In the case of Ukraine, it was the Orange Revolution. And the idea was that we were going to put into power in Ukraine someone who would be sympathetic to the West, and we would turn Ukraine into a liberal democracy that was loyal to the United States. It's very important to understand that Donald Trump is the anomaly. And this is why so many Republicans and virtually all Democrats are screaming bloody murder about what Trump is doing with regard to U.S. relations with both Russia and the Europeans. The really important question was what were we going to do when the Cold War ended? The Soviet Union shortly thereafter disappeared, and we were the most powerful state in the world. We could have drawn down our commitments all over the world, reduced the number of bases, spent much less money on defense. But again, we pursued this liberal foreign policy that was designed to remake the world. And the end result is that, if anything, we increased the number of bases. We interfered in the politics of more countries than we even interfered in during the Cold War, and we spent huge amounts of money. But you want to remember that a lot of those bases in that huge Pentagon budget came out of the Cold War, which was a different story than what we saw in the unipolar moment. I like to say that the Republicans and the Democrats are Tweedledee and Tweedledum. That's true as long as you exclude Trump. But if you bring Trump into the equation, the Republicans with him at the helm look very different than the Democrats. I think initially they thought the United States was so powerful that it could just shove NATO expansion into both Georgia and Ukraine down the Russians' throat. And then I think they also believed that if a war did break out, that we would beat the Russians. I think this is why there was no really serious move on our part to prevent a war in February of 2022. And this is why, once the war started, we advised Zelensky to walk away from the negotiations. We thought we had the Russians right where we wanted them, and we would inflict a decisive defeat on them. You want to remember that we shoved NATO expansion down their throat in 1999, and then we did it again in 2004. And I think the widespread belief in the corridors of power in the United States, and this, of course, includes Victoria Nuland, was that we could do it again with regard to Ukraine. I think it's this mentality that informed her thinking, and of course, the thinking of many others as well. I think the foreign policy establishment in the West, not just in the United States, but in the West, is so deeply committed to the narrative that Vladimir Putin is the equivalent of Adolf, and that he is solely responsible for the war in Ukraine, and that we bear no responsibility, that it's almost impossible to get most people or the overwhelming majority of people in the foreign policy establishment to face up to reality, which is to say that argument is dead wrong. The fact is that guys like Mike McFaul have a lot of blood on their hands. They're principally responsible for causing this war, and prolonging it makes absolutely no sense, not only from our point of view and not only from the Russians' point of view, but most importantly from Ukraine's point of view. So I think what Trump is going to have to do here, to put it in rather crude language, is he's going to have to shove this deal down the throat of the foreign policy establishment. They're going to argue against what he's doing for the foreseeable future. And he's just going to have to say, I don't care. We're going to have an agreement with the Russians, and then we're going to coerce the Ukrainians, and to a lesser extent, the Europeans, because they don't matter that much, but coerce the Ukrainians into accepting that deal. What happens if we listen to Mike McFaul and his ilk? The end result is the war will go on and on. More Ukrainians will die, Ukraine will lose more territory, and the United States will face an even bigger disaster in 2 years than it faces now. I think his whole approach to this has been wrong from the beginning. I've thought for a long time that once it became clear that Trump was bailing on Ukraine, that he was not going to continue to act like Joe Biden toward Ukraine, that would have significant psychological effects on the frontline forces. I used to say to myself, or I say to myself, how could it be otherwise?
Yeah.
You're losing with American support. You're suffering great casualties. And now the Americans are bailing on you. What's the point of continuing the fight? And then in that scenario, you could imagine the Ukrainian army beginning to crumble. So this could contribute to that for sure. But I do think that what will happen here initially is that I think many Ukrainians will feel good about the fact that Zelensky has played the role of the tough guy with Trump. Well, you could tell two different stories. One is that they will see this, which they obviously will. The whole world will see this. And they'll feel good about what Zelensky did. They'll think that Zelensky stood up for Ukraine and he stood up to Trump. And when Trump tried to browbeat him, Zelensky fired right back. So I think some people will feel that way. Maybe many will feel that way. We're talking here about many Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines. But on the other hand, one would think that they would understand, here again, we're talking about the Ukrainian soldiers, that this means that the United States is through with Ukraine. And at some point, it's going to cut off the flow of military aid. And that means Ukraine is doomed. And then the logic that you were spinning out begins to kick in. And that's to say, this is all hopeless. I think that Trump has interests that go beyond Ukraine. I think Trump understands that there are a number of other security problems in Eastern Europe that need to be shut down. And that's why Trump is interested in this whole issue of crafting some sort of security architecture that covers Eastern Europe as well as all of Europe, if possible. I think both Trump and Putin want to put an end to the trouble that's been taking place in Europe in recent years. And that requires an overarching security architecture. So I think he has a lot of different reasons for wanting to end the Ukraine war. Now, you raised the issue of arms control and another START agreement. I think Trump is basically interested in an arms control agreement. But I think arms control moving forward is going to be an extremely thorny issue. And the reason is that we now live in a world where there are three great powers instead of two great powers. You and I are old enough to remember the Cold War and the great difficulty the United States and the Soviet Union had crafting arms control agreements when there were only two great powers in the system, the United States and the Soviet Union. Well, now you have three great powers, the Chinese, the Russians, and the Americans. And if you're going to craft meaningful arms control agreements, dealing with things like strategic nuclear weapons or intermediate range nuclear weapons, it's going to have to be done with all three powers. And that's going to be very difficult to get agreement with all three. So I think arms control is going to have a very rocky future. I also think that Trump is interested in pivoting to Asia. I think that Trump has his gun sights on China. I think he's interested in containing China. And I think to do that, he understands that you want to pivot out of Europe to pivot toward East Asia. I also think he understands that pushing the Chinese and the Russians together, or to put it in slightly different terms, pushing the Russians into the arms of the Chinese by continuing this Ukraine war doesn't make any sense at all. So you have this rather unusual situation where it's Donald Trump who's talking about peace. He's the peace president. And it was Joe Biden who was the war president. And Zelensky and Biden were birds of a feather. And the problem that Zelensky faces is that he now is dealing with a partner, and I use that word loosely, in President Trump, who has a fundamentally different view on the whole issue of war versus peace. And what Trump wants to do is come up with a peaceful agreement that he argues, I think quite correctly, Trump I'm talking about here, will work to Zelensky's advantage or to Ukraine's advantage. It's funny, but I think both you and I agree that what Zelensky wants is not good for Ukraine. What Trump wants is good for Ukraine. The difference between Biden and Trump is just so stark. First of all, Trump is a much more forceful leader than Biden was. But furthermore, Biden was a warmonger, and Trump, for all his flaws, is not a warmonger. He's interested in shutting the war in Ukraine down, and he's not interested in starting any more wars. He's actually made that quite clear with regard to Iran, where the Israelis would really like us to take out the big stick and pound Iran. And he doesn't want a war with Iran, and he wants to shut this war down. I mean, this actually may work to cause Trump to call the Kremlin very quickly and to shut this one down as quickly as possible. You can tell a plausible story about how that happens. But I think the Russians are just sitting back and enjoying watching this. I don't think the Russians have to do anything but just sit back and wait till the Trump administration comes to them, and then hopefully they can cut a deal quickly, and that it doesn't get dragged out. That's what concerns me. I worry that the Ukrainians may be able to drag this out, in which case it would work to their disadvantage because they would just lose more territory and more people would get killed. Well, the Europeans just don't matter much. There are three players in this situation who really matter. One, obviously, the Russians. Two, obviously, the Americans. And three, obviously, the Ukrainians. But the Europeans don't matter much. To make this deal work, what Trump has to do is he has to satisfy the Russians. And then he has to get the Ukrainians to go along with the deal that Trump works out with the Russians. That's really the essence of what needs to be done here. And they'll in the end go along with whatever Trump and the Russians work out. The key is the Ukrainians. And the Europeans just don't matter much. They don't have much power. And furthermore, without the United States on top of them coordinating things, they're just huge collective action problems at play, and they're at each other's throats. So they just don't matter much. And the other thing is, if you think about this, Trump has no exit option. If he walks away from the negotiations, what does he do then? He ends up as Joe Biden too. And that's not what he wants. And the Russians have surely figured this out, that Trump really has no option but to just go forward. I mean, we're losing on the battlefield. There's no way we can rescue the situation. But you want to understand that from Trump's point of view at this point in time, the name of the game is to make sure he does everything possible to get the Ukrainians to agree to the deal that he works out with the Russians. That's going to be mighty difficult to do. But there's no question, you're right, that if we just cut off the flow of weaponry completely, that Ukraine would be doomed very quickly. And it might make sense. It's very hard to know for sure from outside the Trump administration, but it might make sense to let those weapons that are now in the pipeline continue to go to Ukraine and use the threat of cutting them off as a lever to get Ukraine to go along with the deal that Trump works out with the Russians. I mean, that may be their thinking. It's just very hard to tell.